back. In this video I'm talking about the Marshall JCM800 2203. It's been a while since my last video, but I've been hard at work on my website. I've added a lot of photos, internal photos of basically everything that I own. I've also put some schematics up there, so be sure to check that out if you're into that. I'm still going to go over the circuit and schematic and history and stuff a little later in the video, but I want to talk about what makes this amp such an important piece of music history, why it's so commonly used, and why this basic design is the basis for so many other things. I mean, how many times have you heard someone say about some other amp or product, it sounds like a JCM800 but something, JCM800 but more bass, JCM800 but more saturation, JCM800 like rhythm channel, etc. It gets used in marketing fluff. The design itself has been the basis for a lot of other designs. There's modded Marshalls, there's boutique amps that use some sort of similar design to this. And it's a really, really simple amp. It doesn't have a lot going on. It does have, this particular example is a 2005 reissue, so I do have an effects loop on the back. You did hear that in the very beginning. I had a reverb and a delay in the loop, and I was also boosting the front end with a Boss SD1. I've got a couple of other boosts here that I'll flip on and off throughout the video, but I'm going to turn that off for right now. And the speaker cabinet I'm using is a 1986 JCM800 cabinet with G12T75s, the old school ones with a little vent. And my microphone setup, I have two Shure SM57s. One is mounted directly at the cone and the other one is at an angle, so they're slightly offset. And that's called the Fredman technique. It kind of brings out the fullness of the tone. I really like the way it sounds mixed, but I'll also isolate those microphones so you can hear what they sound like individually. So let's get right into it. It's got pretty simple controls. There's only 6 knobs on the front panel. You have the preamp volume, which is like your gain control, a master volume control, treble, middle, bass, and presence. So very, very simple. On the back panel on this particular amp, because I have the effects loop, that also has 2 buttons on it. There's a bypass button that completely bypasses the effects loop and a level button that goes from +4 or -10 dB if you're using rack or pedal effects. It can't be foot switched or anything like that. There's no channel switching or foot switching on this amp at all. You also have this high and low input, but you can't use both inputs at the same time. Like if you have an ABY pedal like the one I have here, if I plug that yellow cable into the low input will override the high input. So you can't switch between them, it's one or the other. And I am going to talk about the low input a little bit, but we'll get to that later. For right now, let's hear how it sounds just as is. I still have that reverb and delay in the loop. So already a really great tone, and these are my preferred settings. I have the bass turned all the way up, and the mids a little over half at 6, treble down to about 3, and the presence is right in the middle. The bass all the way up, I think on a modern amp would get really, really, you know, farty and flubby in the low end, especially under high gain, but this is not that high gain of an amp right out of the box. It's not going to do like modern metal or anything like that without a boost pedal, which is part of why it's popular to boost these, but also the tone of the amp is very conducive to being boosted. So let me turn those pedals off and I'll kick on a boost and you can hear just the difference in the sound. So as you can hear, even with the bass turned all the way up, it's still very, very tight in the low end. If I kick on the OCD, which is even more driving and cuts a little less bass than like the SD1 or the Tube Screamer, it's still pretty tight. So I really, really love that tone, and I'm going to experiment with the EQ a little bit here. I'm going to keep the gain completely maxed out for right now, and I just want to show how much reach this amp has just on its own. So if I roll that bass down a little bit and we kick the mids down, And I'll turn that treble up just a hair over half. It is a very bright cutting amp, so you kind of have to be careful with the presence and treble controls because it can get a little ice picky, a little overbearing, especially depending on your speakers. But these are pretty dark speakers, and with this microphone setup, I'm not as afraid of getting too piercing with it. I'm also not playing in a mix where I might need that extra cut, so keep that in mind if you're dialing this amp to go alongside like a bass, drums, singer, or that kind of thing. Something else I really like to do is to turn the treble way, way down and then keep the presence up high, and that kind of adds a unique character to the tone if I set everything back in the middle there. And if I do the opposite, the feel of the amp is similar, but the tone is different, and I really like that dynamic. And another example of EQing with your ears and not your eyes, I kind of was experimenting with this earlier. If you turn all the controls down, and I'll leave the presence at half because that's the power amp anyway, but if I keep the controls all the way down, you'll hear it's very, very dark sounding. I have to turn the noise gate off actually. And you can bring in the frequencies that you want. And the mids control actually, it feels a little bit more, it's clearly an upper mids punch thing. If I dial that in a little bit, you can hear just how cutting. And I think also because of the bright nature of the amp, it sort of makes itself Really, really dynamic feeling under the fingers. If you pick lightly, it doesn't feel as distorted. If you roll off your guitar volume, you can really control how much drive you're getting, and especially between some pedals on the front end, you can do a lot of stuff with this amp, especially considering it's a single channel affair. And of course, if I roll the gain down on the amp, I still can get pretty good tones. But the brightness of the amp seems to go up when you roll that down, and that kind of makes sense. There is a bright cap across that pot, so it retains some brightness with it turned down, but it can be a little bit piercing at times. So that's part of why my preferred settings is so bass heavy, at least sitting in the room with it. Let's use that low input now. If I put it on the low input, I'm actually going to turn the gain all the way back up to max, and it's still pretty clean. I'm sure it's no Fender Twin substitute, but it sounds pretty good to me. And of course, when you're on the low input, you can still boost it with whatever pedals you like. So even though it's not a multi-channel amp, you can still get some functionality like that if you're the kind of person that prefers a single channel amp with pedals compared to like a channel switcher or something like that. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the origins of the JCM800 2203 circuit. You're probably most familiar with this style of visual aesthetic because this is what most modern Marshall amps look like. But this circuit was actually introduced in 1975 as part of the JMP series. The JMP series also contained the 4-input style amps like this, the 1959 and 1987 models. And I did do a review talking about this particular 1987 reissue model, so check out that video if you want to know more about that particular circuit. It's mainly worth mentioning that the JCM800 series not only contained the 2203 circuit, but it also contained the 1987 and 1959 circuits with the 4 inputs like this, as well as a new model of amp introduced just with the JCM800 series like this, the 2210 and 2205 split channel amps. And these are true channel switchers. They have a clean and an overdrive channel, sort of, and they're actually probably my favorite Marshalls, and I'm going to do a video talking about them in a little bit more detail. And of course, there are some Marshall amps that don't have a series that they're a part of, like the Silver Jubilee or the 6100 Anniversary or the Vintage Modern, but those are usually related to the series that existed when they came out. So I'm also going to talk about the Silver Jubilee again and compare it actually with this amp because they have some similarities, but more on that a little later. Thanks to the Mojo Tone kit website, they do have schematics up for the 1976 and 1978 circuits for the JMP. And you'll notice that there's a very noticeable difference early in the preamp, as well as this bright cap across the phase inverter. But the main thing I want to talk about is the preamp. So the JMP 2203, the original circuit, if you plug into the high input, you go through one gain stage, and then your volume control, preamp volume control, a second gain stage, cathode follower, and then you've got your tone stack, master volume control, and out to the power amp. So there's only 2 gain stages on that amp, and when you plug into the low input, it's kind of the same thing. You've got one gain stage here, into the preamp control, second gain stage, so on and so forth. But the biggest difference is that the low input, the first gain stage is biased to be a lot cleaner. So that's the main difference between the 2 inputs on those amps. Otherwise, they're both 2 gain stages. They both go through the same tone stack and so on. So that makes them really, really simple. But the later circuit, like this, it's a little bit different. Your high input, you go through one gain stage here, and then it actually routes through the low input. And then you've got your preamp gain control. These are in parallel here. Second gain stage and third gain stage, cathode follower, tone stack, master volume, etc. So you've got 3 gain stages on the high input now by 1978. When you're using the low input, the way that that works is it actually skips the first gain stage and just goes directly into what was the second gain stage. So in the low input, you only have 2 gain stages, 1 and 2, basically skipping the first gain stage. So it still follows the same signal path. But there's a very clear difference between the high input on the earlier amps versus the later amps. And I'm going to show the 1981 dated schematic for the JCM800 series, which still contain the 87 and 59 models. So these have the 4 inputs, one for each channel in parallel, just like a Plexi style amp, as well as the later high and low input like I just showed. But just for the sake of convenience, I'm going to show it on the 88 schematic. Okay, so on the 88 schematic, it's just a little bit more clear, easier to read. So you plug into the high input, and it goes through your first gain stage, and then you've got your preamp volume control and second gain stage. Then you've got your third gain stage, cathode follower, and your treble middle bass, and master volume out to the power amp. And then the low input skips the first gain stage, goes through the preamp volume, first gain stage for that, second gain stage for that, but it still has the same cathode follower, tone stack, etc. One of the features of this amp that gives it its most trademark tone is that the second gain stage on this amp is a cold clipper. This 10K value resistor here is introducing a lot of grit and drive into that second gain stage. And I've heard cold clippers talked about a lot with the Soldano SLO, or the Bogner Ecstasy Red channel, for example, has a cold clipper. But the JCM800 2203 also has a cold clipper, so that's part of the signature sound of this amp. And I'm also going to follow the signal path on the reissue schematic. This one, if it follows the, though this is notated a little bit differently where you've got both sides of the 12AX7 in the same block. So the input from the high goes through the plate to the anode, and let's see, follows that around to the low input. And then the preamp volume or gain control. And then your second gain stage is this half of the tube. And then we go out. Third gain stage, up over to the plate, down to the cathode. There's our cathode follower. And treble middle bass. This one's your master volume, and then W4 is just out to the power amp. Or could be the effects loop if you have the effects loop engaged. But it's still, even though it's shown differently on the circuit diagram, it's still the same schematic as the previous design here. Now the reissue 2203 was based on the very early run JCM800s, and you can see the chassis of my reissue right here. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 filter caps, and on the inside you've got the vertical inputs. All of the pots are mounted to the chassis directly. The effects loop board is this little guy down here, but the main board is actually really similar to a vintage JCM800, but they did have to make some changes for compliance. There's a lot more rules about using lead-free solder and certain things that you can't do anymore. I don't know all the exact details of that, but my understanding is that they spent a lot of time in 2002 to 2003 working on creating a faithful reproduction based on that original amp. All right, so let's talk about some of the odd details that come up when shopping for vintage JCM800s. One of the most notable differences is that most early 80s Marshalls came with 6550 tubes instead of EL34s, at least in the US. And that's because the EL34 was generally considered less reliable by US distributors at the time, so they preferred 6550s. They do sound quite a bit different. A 6550 is really similar to like a KT88, which is certainly capable of dissipating a lot more power than 100 watts, which also gives the impression of just how loud these amps can be. I mean, 4 KT88s or 4 6550s is well over 100 watts if you wanted to set it up that way. These 6550 tubes lasted until about 1985, but generally by 85 or 86, EL34s were back in common rotation. So if you have a later Marshall JCM800 amp, it probably has EL34s in it factory. If you did have 6550 tubes in it, it could easily be modified to accommodate EL34, so that's not really an issue. I think it's just one resistor or something in the bias circuit. Another thing that changed over the course of time is the kind of more famous Drake transformers, which were used in both 50 and 100 watt amps, started to get used mostly in 50 watt amps, and then disappeared altogether sometime in the mid 80s with all of them having diagonal transformers. If we look back at the reissue that I have here, that is a diagonal transformer on there, but for example, I own this 1985 2205 model, which has Drake transformers in it. So it kind of just depends on luck, really, which transformer you're going to get when it comes to vintage ones, at least. Also, in 1984 and later, the input on the front of the 2203 and 2204 circuit changed to these horizontal inputs. So you've probably heard the terms horizontal input or vertical input thrown around. The main difference between the horizontal input and the vertical input amps is the interior construction. So this is a horizontal input amp. In this case, 2 power tubes. This is a 2204, but it's still similar enough to worth mentioning. You can see that all of the pots are mounted to the actual circuit board, and the circuit board has moved from kind of the middle of the amp right up against the panel. So that's a big difference between the construction of the old amps. The tubes are still mounted to the chassis, but the circuit board is now attached in this way. You'll also note that this 2204 only has 3 filter caps. That is true for all 2204 amps. They all only had these 3 filter caps. But I have seen, in this case, this one also has 6. But I have seen JCM800 2203s with fewer filter caps as time goes on. And basically I've seen them with 5, I've seen them with 4, and most later 2203 amps only have 3 filter caps, just like a 2204. So later amps also had a change in the high tension power supply. This affects the voltage that's being applied to the tubes, and later amps that have fewer filter caps run a higher HT voltage. Some players describe this as feeling stiff, but there is more headroom in that way, so it's kind of up to taste whether you like it or not. There's also been some changes to the B+ voltage. Higher B+ amps started in 82 or 83, so pretty early in the run, but a higher B+ gives a more immediate, brighter response. There's a lot of variation in these amps, not just across years, although that helps for narrowing things down, but 2 amps made in the same year based on the serial number might have vastly different specs, and especially as time has gone on and 30 years of component wear and repairs and replacements and so on, they can sound very, very different. So in that same spirit, the reissue versus the original, besides some changes to the circuit to make it compatible with modern safety specs, it's better to consider the reissue as kind of picking up where they left off as opposed to being an exact replica of an early year amp. If you owned a specific JCM800 2203 and you want to recreate that exact sound, it's very possible that the reissue won't do it exactly because of different circuit values, different wear and tear, and also some fallible human memory mixed in there. So it'll get you really, really close, but that's part of the reason why the modded Marshall scene is so big. People, you think of a modern Marshall as introducing diode clipping or extra gain stages or different voicing or extra channels, all that kind of stuff. But a lot of modded Marshall stuff is just introducing really basic stuff like changing a bright cap value or lowering a resistor value or just a couple of minor things to tweak the circuit to sound like that old school vintage amp that maybe you owned before or maybe is a sound in your head, that kind of thing. Alright, thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more content like this. I'm also working on some comparison videos and some other stuff, so I'll try not to leave you guys hanging for another 9 months this time. I'm definitely going to do a 2210, 2205 video soon, and the 2555 Silver Jubilee I actually have open on the bench right now, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit as well. Alright, have a good one. Let's get you down.
Thank you.